the top-rated cable news host being just out of the blue ousted from his own show and told, I think, just a few minutes before it was announced publicly, and not given a chance to do one final show to say goodbye to his audience. Just Tucker Carlson just ousted, and a lot of speculation as to what really happened, and that's all we can really do at this point is speculate. But one factor that I keep coming back to is it's just a fact that for all the disagreements that people like us have with Tucker Carlson on many issues, it's just a fact that on cable news, he was the only place that was airing anti-war voices consistently, whether it's the war in Ukraine or the proxy war in Syria. That was a consistent source of anti-war views, and people don't like it when we say that, but it's just true. It's not. It doesn't mean that Tucker Carlson was right about everything. And again, there's so many things where I vehemently disagree with him. But on these core issues, he stood apart, and I have to guess or speculate that was probably a factor in him being fired so abruptly.
It's obvious. It's so obvious that the content of his show that cut against the grain of every other cable news host, especially Sean Hannity, who follows him, whose ratings are tanking now that Tucker's off. It's obvious when he's the top rated host. It's obvious that was the reason. That was what caused him to come into conflict with Murdoch's sons, who were like centrists, and that there was enormous pressure. Now, advertiser pressure is always a factor. I don't know why everyone is discounting that. First, there was advertiser pressure on Tucker that caused a lot of advertisers to drop out because, he was pro-Trump. He was, pushing the line on a lot of issues where we totally disagree with him on it. And then Mike Lindell, my pillow guy, comes in and fills the void. But that is not, Mike Lindell is the top advertiser on Fox News, but he's not the only major advertiser. And many of those who advertise on Fox News are Big Pharma. And Tucker was also upsetting Big Pharma interests when he broke away from the COVID consensus and started harshly criticizing the mRNA vaccine, the lockdowns, and everything else. And if we look at, who actually is sponsoring Fox News beyond Mike Lindell, it's, as I said, it's Big Pharma, GlaxoSmithKline, Novartis, and then BlackRock, which owns a lot of the pharmaceutical companies, are right behind MyPillow. Then the largest institutional owner is Vanguard. They have a 7% stake. BlackRock just increased its stake. They're the two largest owners of Pfizer. They're the two largest owners of Johnson & Johnson. They own over 15% of Fox. So they also own 15% of Johnson & Johnson, and they own 13% of Moderna. So the idea that Big Pharma wasn't interested in this, or the Pentagon, Politico has a piece out. I don't have it right in front of me. Department of Defense officials celebrating Tucker's ouster because they were sick of him. What did they say? We're sick of him bagging on our military night after night. So,
yeah, they portrayed it as like Tucker was like insulting the rank and file. When really, actually, they also actually admitted that he's popular with the rank and file, and what they don't like, and here's the article, is that he was criticizing the proxy war in Ukraine. That's what really this is all about. There it is. That's just an amazing headline in itself. Like, good riddance. Pentagon officials cheer Tucker. Like, the fact that you have the Pentagon openly celebrating the ouster of a journalist, like of a television host, it really says something. And, the way this article frames it is they want to suggest it's because Tucker was critical of like the Pentagon's diversity policies and all that stuff. You think Pentagon leaders care that a cable news host is making fun of their diversity policies or whatever those are? No, he was pushing back against the consensus on the Ukraine proxy war and questioning constantly with his monologues and his guests the need to pour tens of billions of dollars in this proxy war in Ukraine. Of course, that's what they're upset about. And that's why they can't contain their glee now that he's out. Good riddance. And, I hope people who tried to just dismiss Tucker Carlson's anti-war views or his I shouldn't say anti-war views, but his coverage that was critical of the proxy war in Ukraine. I hope they look at that and reflect on, like, maybe they should reflect the fact that they're in lockstep with the Pentagon here in cheering the ouster of a host, and what that maybe means about their stance. Because again, for all the things to disagree with him on, it's just a fact. He consistently aired anti-war voices on the proxy war in Ukraine, no matter what his own motives were. I don't care what his own personal motives are. I mean, even if, like, the criticism of is, okay, he was only critical of the proxy war in Ukraine because he wants us to fight a war with China. And yeah, he was definitely a hawk on China. But that doesn't actually negate the fact that he was airing and allowing on people who were very critical of the war and airing factual critiques that weren't allowed anywhere else. And also, whenever it came down to it, he actually expressed criticism of the Biden administration when they were warmongering with China. And he also had guests on, like Jimmy Dore and Doug McGregor, who all openly opposed war with China. So even there, this narrative of him that he was a China hawk, it's there's elements of truth to it, but it misses the fact that he allowed on voices that dissented from that, and even himself sometimes pushed back on the warmongering when it comes to China and Taiwan.
We have a comment from Danny Haifong. The advertising angle is compelling, as is Murdoch's attraction to DeSantis. Even controlling for politics, it's obvious Tucker Carlson was too independent for Fox Corporation. And, Danny would be someone who would take extreme issue with a lot of Tucker's stances on China. But I think, and Tucker was definitely someone I would consider to be anti-China, or at least anti-China system, and someone who has issued warnings about China influencing the United States and U.S. politics and the U.S. system that, like, definitely fueled a new Cold War narrative. But it's complex, and we're going to get into that. I think it's important, if you had a relationship with his show, because you've been on the show like we have. You've been on it more than I have. I went on once to denounce Russiagate from a left anti-imperialist point of view back in 2017. It was like the first time anyone got to do that on national TV. And what I said is, they're just setting the stage for a giant war. And I've been proven right, unfortunately. We had Anya Parampil go on to, at Tucker's urging, denounce the coup in Venezuela, a coup against a socialist-oriented country, and to denounce
Trump's coup. Yeah.
Trump's coup. And that got directly to Trump. I mean, we know that Trump responded to that and saw that. And then Anya came back on to denounce the junta, the coup regime that Hillary Clinton brought in Honduras, and to address how the migration crisis from Honduras is really the result of U.S. regime change operations and foreign policy, and that, this is something that I think right-wingers needed to understand better. So she was providing important context. And, Tucker invited me on many other times when I couldn't make it, to talk about how harmful NATO was to the United States. But at every point, I was presenting what I consider to be an anti-war, anti-imperialist analysis. And you were too, Aaron. You played a lot of those clips in your segment guest hosting for Jimmy this week. And I think that's important to understand. And it's also important for people, if they want to celebrate Tucker's ouster from an anti-war angle, that they actually have to have had watched his show, consumed it regularly. And I don't think any of them did.
Yeah, if you go back to your clip from, that was what, 2017, when you were on about Russiagate. That was like the June or July 2017, so relatively early on in Russiagate. One of the things you warned about is that Russiagate was going to be repurposed to attack the left, to attack a Bernie Sanders style candidate, which is exactly what happened. And people who don't appreciate the opportunity to say stuff like that are then basically saying that we should cede the cable news space entirely to pro-Russiagate, pro-war views, and not take the opportunity to warn about how this is not just dangerous for the world, but also just really, really bad for the left. And we weren't allowed to say that on any of the leftist shows, not only on like the, nominally leftist shows on MSNBC. Like, back then Chris Hayes was sort of branded as like the progressive voice on MSNBC, which of course is now like a bygone memory. It doesn't pretend anymore. But even on, again, like the establishment left-wing shows like Democracy Now!, we weren't allowed on those shows to make that point either. The only place we could say it was on the show of this right-wing host, Tucker Carlson, who made space for voices like us over many years and over many issues, not just on Russiagate, but then the Ukraine proxy war, when that broke out, and also on the Syria dirty war, which everybody else either whitewashes or ignores. And again, the fact that you can go and just dismiss all that, you must be saying that you don't think the Syria dirty war is important. And internally, I think that position, accordingly, I think that position actually internalizes some hegemony right there, and accepts hegemony, that we have the right to spend billions of dollars on a dirty war in Syria, and it's someone who actually covers it. It doesn't matter. It's inconsequential. It's not worth acknowledging. Same with the other examples you mentioned of the coup in Venezuela. So yes, Tucker Carlson personally, I think, expressed some views that I found to be very vile, like about immigrants, the way he talked about them, the way he talked about certain individual politicians, even the ones I disagree with, like the Squad. I didn't like it, but hegemony and supremacy can be expressed in different ways. And if you're dismissing somebody who actually singularly covers dirty wars and coups in whether it's Syria or Venezuela, I think you're internalizing some acceptance of hegemony there as well.
Well, it's not strategic. I mean, if you are part of the tiny anti-war movement in the US, whether you're left or right, you just don't have the luxury of carefully choosing your national platform, because every other host is attacking you, the position you represent. They're calling you a Russian asset. They're undermining you. They're discrediting you in the eyes of the entire public. And you have you don't have the luxury. That's why I would take every chance I got to go on RT America, because they gave me also a national platform. At one time, they were broadcasting on cable TV that anyone could access. So it's not strategic. It's actually kind of this, it really helps me understand better the boutique left that also attacked the Rage Against the War Machine rally, because there was a coalition of libertarians and left anti-war forces when that rally clearly broke through. It helps me better understand the boutique left's attack on Tulsi Gabbard when she came in to disrupt the pro-war consensus among the Democratic primary candidates. They came in and attacked her harshly. Jacobin, the same kind of people that are celebrating Tucker's ouster supposedly from the anti-war left. And the way they come at him is so dishonest. I want to address a few of these attacks that I think contain some facts about Tucker's background that are like cringeworthy, but I think they're intellectually dishonest, and they're coming from people, including people I really respect that I've worked with. This is from Alan McLeod and Mint Press. This is an older one that's been going around, and it's about how Tucker wanted to be in the CIA when he was younger. You know, his father is a huge neocon. He would acknowledge that, and he went to Nicaragua when his dad was involved with the Contras, I think. Yeah, Alan is one of the best media critics, left-wing or anti-imperialist media critics around. And he's a great writer, and we've published him at the Grayzone. The thing about that piece is it doesn't say anything about the meaning of Tucker in the current media environment, and it contains, from one of the best media critics around, no content analysis. Absolutely no content analysis. No analysis of what Tucker is actually saying night in and night out when he has a chyron behind him that says DC War Machine, and he's just hammering the imperialists, the neocons, and then hosting people like us. So what is the point of that? It's to keep, it's almost like it's to keep leftists away from Tucker so the lines remain clean. But it doesn't accomplish anything when he's being disruptive and providing us a platform. Then we have, I don't know if you want to add anything there, but there were like tons of pieces that came out this week from left writers about why we should celebrate.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting. I mean, this is where you and I split from other people who we really, really agree with on pretty much everything else. But on this one, I agree with you that I think that there's a blind spot. And I'm all for them condemning his actual views that they don't like. And there's plenty, again, that I think is pretty distasteful, that I found very offensive, things he said before. But to then do that without recognizing that there was some really substantive critiques and just allowance for perspectives that were not aired anywhere else on critical issues of war and peace, I think that's really disingenuous. So criticize him all you want, but then criticize him for his actual views. And it's intellectually dishonest to dismiss those areas where he was far superior than anything else on cable news. And I would say most leftist media on some issues, not everything,
Yeah.
on some issues, but specifically
And
on really important issues like
on Ukraine, all elected progressive officials combined, he was better. And that is one of the most important issues if you're in the anti-war movement. And if the U.S. fails in Ukraine to achieve its goals, what it considers victory, which is retaking even Crimea, Western hegemony starts to unravel. So I think it's a pretty pivotal issue. So why would you celebrate the loss of that unless you're just going to be open? Some people are open about it and they say, well, you know, we're also losing someone who attacks the gender ideology I believe in, or we're also losing someone who says racist things. You know, and if you want to make it about social issues, that would be a more intellectually honest take. But the angle that I see a lot of anti-war people on the left taking, including some, you know, and there's some, I'll straight up say if I don't respect a writer or a pundit or a professional sectarian left activist, I'll straight up say it. But I mean, this is from someone who I think, you know, deserves some respect. Branko Marcetic at Jacobin, he's done a great job on Ukraine. But, you know, the tendency here, to me, this reflects to me an ultra left tendency and also a slightly unfair interpretation of Tucker's anti-China views, because when the beef is about to cook with Taiwan, Tucker has actually taken a line against military confrontation there. So let's just like examine one part of this piece by Branko. He says, as Carlson's coverage of Pelosi's Taiwan visit indicated, even the occasional dovish segment on Tucker Carlson tonight expressing alarm over the risk of provoking Beijing was framed around the need to shore up U.S. military strength when Congress is passing record military budgets and blah, 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 the U.S. military budget is high. So it wasn't good enough. The segment wasn't good enough for him, and therefore it deserves to be denounced, even though no other cable host was taking on Nancy Pelosi's extremely provocative, warmongering visit to Taiwan, which has helped set the stage or accelerate the current crisis. So what good is it to denounce that? Let's take a look at the segment.
Was anybody on MSNBC or CNN criticizing Nancy Pelosi for trying to stoke a war? Which I mean, no, of course not. And by the way, even the framing, like Tucker Carlson is not an anti-imperialist. Like, no shit. Like, who says he's an anti-imperialist? The point is, does he air anti-imperialist voices that are otherwise shunned and maligned? The answer is yes. So then who cares if he's not personally an anti-imperialist? I don't care about his own personal views. It's a question of what he airs on air, especially when those views are not allowed anywhere else.
I mean, it's a question of having a realistic outlook on politics in the United States. There's the anti-war movement is being actively destroyed by every other host, including Sean Hannity. But there's so little alarm. Do you ever notice that? There's so little alarm among leftists about Sean Hannity's existence. When Hannity, he's completely consistent with the DC Uniparty and with the anti-immigrant, xenophobic, anti-gay, anti-feminist, anti-abortion Republicans for the most part. Maybe he's not as articulate or compelling as Tucker, but if Sean Hannity was asked, I don't think there'd be this flood of articles justifying it. And it's weird to me. So I actually can't pull up the segment because my Wi-Fi is too weak, but it's right below. If
I can share it,
If you want to share it, this is. And we'll play some Tucker China clips because I mean you played a lot of clips from him on Ukraine, and his views are pretty well known, just demolishing Zelensky night after night. But I find this interesting.
This week with the black, she's definitely coming, one source told the Wall Street Journal. The only variable is whether she spends the night. So Nancy Pelosi goes to Taipei. What's the effect of that? Well, we don't need to guess. The Chinese government has said repeatedly and clearly that if Nancy Pelosi lands in Taiwan, it could trigger a global war. Watch.
A Chinese spokesperson said there would be serious consequences for the visit over the weekend, conducting military drills at sea.
If House Speaker Pelosi insists on visiting Taiwan, China will take resolute and strong measures to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Are they bluffing? It doesn't sound like it, actually. A representative of Chinese state media said this, quote, if U.S. fighter jets escort Pelosi's plane into Taiwan, it is an invasion. The Chinese army has the right to forcibly dispel Pelosi's plane and the U.S. fighter jets, including firing warning shots and making tactical movement of obstruction. If ineffective, then shoot them down. Oh, shoot them down. Okay. So the White House naturally was asked about this. We're suddenly on the brink of yet another global war, essentially a nuclear war, because Nancy Pelosi has been given the green light by the White House to fly to Taiwan. So what's the White House view of this? Listen.
An official who is associated with Chinese state media is suggesting that if Speaker Pelosi tries to go to Taiwan, her plane could be shot down. Does the president?
Okay, so we get the point here. But I mean, it's pretty clear. The point he's trying to get across is that dangerous pro-war elements in Washington are pushing for war with Taiwan, and that we should be opposed to that. And he was the only cable news host. He's being caricatured in all of these takes as someone who wants war with China. When I think we could go up to the line of that, he is definitely pushing in new Cold War hysteria on China at some
Absolutely.
point.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I just don't see when every other cable news host is doing exactly the same thing. We have, Doug McGregor denouncing U.S. aggression against China on Tucker. I don't know if you want to play any of those.
Administration in living memory. We don't have anyone that qualifies as a statesman. Statesmanship involves advancing American interests at the least cost to the American people. None of that is in play here. We're dealing with a group of posers, people who are posturing. Posturing is not statesmanship. And the American people need to understand something that no one has bothered to tell them, that during World War II, Taiwan was the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces. All the major invasions of China were launched from Taiwan. Beijing will not allow Taiwan to become a garrison state.
Let's see here.
Forces or any foreign power. And if they think that we are going to ally ourselves with Taiwan, if they think we are going to intervene to defend that island in the event of a dispute, then we will be at war with China for the reasons that I just outlined. And we are not prepared for that.
All right, this clip is giving me some issues. Let me try one more.
But we get the point. And Doug McGregor, not an anti-imperialist leftist. I mean, we got to talk on. Oh no, we're not going to have someone on who is like a key Pentagon advisor in a U.S. administration who's hammering U.S. policy from Ukraine to Taiwan. We're not supposed to do that. Like, you got attacked by those ultra leftists at Vanguard. What do they want us to do? Are we only supposed to have like these little like soy jack pundits on who dabble only within these small circles of ardent card-carrying socialists to denounce the war? Are we supposed to have people on who actually are involved in policy, who are making these statements and disrupting the war machine at a high level? Are we allowed to hear from them in alternative media? I mean, it's completely crazy that we're supposed to write off this entire contingent within the foreign policy. I wouldn't call the foreign policy establishment, but within an alternative elite foreign policy circles who come out of the military, who are actually trying to stop a war. That's such immature politics to me.
It would be great if senior Pentagon officials like Doug McGregor, had views like Cornel West or Chris Hedges, but unfortunately, they don't really make military people like that, at least that I'm aware of. They all have, conservative social views. And the question,
well, wait a minute. No. What the Democrats and a lot of people on the left are comfortable with is like the woke generals like Mark Milley, who are putting an intersectional face on the Pentagon. And I love when Tucker denounces that, because when you see these diverse generals, or trans generals. It's nothing against that I'm saying against trans people or any people from minority backgrounds in the military. It's that this is branding imperialism so that imperialism can be more resilient and therefore more insidious and win over more progressive people. And so it deserves to be called out. And yet they, Mark Milley, these generals who are unlike McGregor, who is decidedly anti-woke, are dangerous characters who are more likely to take us to nuclear war. So that's another factor here.
Yeah, and here's McGregor basically, just going back to that clip about China. This is more of what McGregor said, and this clip should work.
Why every show on TV is not covering this right now? This seems like one of the craziest things that's happened in my lifetime. Do you have any speculation and guess as to why the Biden administration would want this?
Well, the Biden administration and its predecessors, frankly, treated everything that the Russian government said for the last 15 years about Ukraine with complete contempt. They're repeating that process. We see how well that's worked out in Ukraine. The Russians were always serious. Hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost in this war in Ukraine that we should have acted quickly to stop. Now we're provoking the Chinese over an issue that is at least as strategically important to them.
So, that's an example of a guest coming on and actually, unlike every other network show at the time, pushing back on the war hysteria over China and Taiwan. And just recently there was a war game in Congress where a group of bipartisan members of Congress on the China committee, whatever it's called, did a war game scenario about going to war with China over Taiwan. And their takeaway was, we have to arm Taiwan to the teeth, much like they said about Ukraine as well. And on cable news, this was the only show, even as Tucker Carlson fed into all this new Cold War stuff with China, he did, that was still on this issue of at least going to war, was airing voices like this.
Well, again, it comes down to motivations. Like, do I care if his motivation, if he doesn't love China or hates China's system, but does not want to get involved in a war in the South China Sea or a regional war? I mean, that is kind of a traditional Buchananite, you could call it an isolationist position. Do I care? I mean, I'm just going to be strategic and try to stop this war. And I can't go as an anti-war figure. I can't go forward with the cable news hosts I want. I go forward with the cable news hosts we have, to paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld on the army in Iraq. And there are no cable news hosts left that I can think of who are really pushing back against this war in any meaningful way. By the way, going back to Tucker being in Nicaragua when he was young, when the Contras were being backed by the CIA to destabilize that government, did he ever support the disgusting 2018 regime change operation that took place 5 years ago? It was going on to this, like exactly 5 years ago today, when hundreds of Nicaraguans were being killed and tortured for being Sandinistas. Did he support that? Did he give any support to that? No. He moved in the opposite direction in many ways by hosting Anya on Honduras and Venezuela. So, and meanwhile,
whereas
day in and day out, CNN was supporting that regime change operation.
Yeah. And so is Democracy Now!, by the way. Democracy Now! Totally whitewashed that as well. So, I mean, that's a case where, again, there are many issues where are placed like CNN and Democracy Now! Are better, I think, than Tucker on some issues. But again, on these important issues like coups abroad, proxy wars, trying to destabilize a country, you have cases where Tucker is just better. That's just true. And it shouldn't be difficult to acknowledge that. And by the way, when people bring up the fact that his father is working for Voice of America, right, in Nicaragua, and trying to basically support the propaganda operations that help sustain the dirty war in Nicaragua. Well, he also recently brought on Dan Kovalik, who has done, I think, more than a few people in the U.S. have done more to challenge the U.S. campaign against Nicaragua than Dan Kovalik. He wrote a book about it.
I can tell you, I went to Nicaragua with Dan in 2018 to do reporting on the coup. Dan was riding in the back of a pickup with me to the July 19th celebration with the Sandinistas of overcoming that coup. He's just a dyed-in-the-wool anti-imperialist from the left. And Tucker hosted him for a full hour.
Yeah. Yeah.
A full hour. I mean, this is the kind of media environment we have to embrace, in my opinion, as people who want to gain traction and educate Americans and raise their consciousness on the war state. And it's opening up to people like us. And it's not just with Tucker. We can't just remain in our little caves because, you know, we're already losing.
Yeah. I mean, just like there's no one who is like more like stereotypically archetypally anti-imperialist than Dan Kovalik, and he was on the Tucker show for like an hour, and they talked about Nicaragua, they talked about the new Cold War with Russia, and you will not find someone like Dan Kovalik getting an airspace anywhere else. And I just, you know, people want me to dismiss that. Sorry, I just can't.
Yeah, and back to your point about Democracy Now! Being one of the main platforms for supporting the violent coup backed by the U.S. in Nicaragua in 2018. The U.S. left generally, in my opinion, sucks. I mean, I've just come to decide that it sucks. I don't care if you say I'm not a part of it or whatever they want to say about me. I don't care, because I've had to go through this process, first with the dirty war in Syria, where when I started to expose key elements of it, it was the left and leftist groups like the International Socialist Organization, like the modern version of the Congress on Cultural Freedom, and all those phony leftist groups that the CIA created in the 60s and 50s. They were the ones who went after me. It's today the World Socialist website that's constantly going after me because I was from the left opposing the lockdowns that absolutely destroyed the education and livelihoods of some of the most vulnerable people, not just in the United States, but around the world, and generally for nothing. I opposed the vaccine mandates from the left, and they went after me so viciously, so many of them. It started with Syria, it started with that. The left, such large swaths of the left have supported so many regime change operations and so many wars. And many of them have been, I mean, Branko's a great exception. Many of them have been centered around Jacobin. And I want to take it back to Jacobin for a second, because there's another attack on Tucker. And I think there are some valid points in it. It deals with domestic politics. And I think the author, Ben Burgess, is being a little more intellectually honest on those issues. Forgive my slow Wi-Fi here. But there's one part I want to zero in on. Nice restrained headline. Tucker Carlson is a repugnant pseudo-populist fraud. Blah, blah, blah. But here's an interesting part that's classic Jacobin. Compare, for instance, Carlson's segment pushing back against the idea that we should hate warmongering Russian President Vladimir Putin with the attitude of socialist leader Eugene V. Debs, who went to jail for his fiery speech opposing U.S. entry into World War I, but took it for granted that he should also denounce the German Kaiser and show solidarity with his anti-war comrades in Germany. Okay, let's just pick apart that paragraph. Tucker, according to Ben Burgess, has to denounce Vladimir Putin as a warmonger, which completely decontextualizes the position that Russia is in. It's an ahistorical statement to call Vladimir Putin a warmonger. You can criticize Putin, you can condemn his invasion. You, Aaron, took a position opposing it, but it's an ahistorical, childish statement, and it demands that Tucker do something that Eugene Debs do in order to prove his worth, which means that people on the left or who are anti-war can only necessarily support fellow travelers, and they must celebrate Tucker's ouster because he simply was not Eugene V. Debs. And by the way, the U.S. attitude towards Germany and the overall attitude of the victors of World War I towards Germany and the German Kaiser, which amounted to the Versailles Treaty, set the stage for World War II. So I don't know what's so great about denouncing Germany in World War I. Like, wow, I admire Eugene Debs, but wow. But this is classic Jacobin. Vladimir Putin's a warmonger. Vladimir Putin is an imperialist. It shows a complete lack of understanding of what imperialism is. It completely whitewashes, or it saps of meaning, the true essence of what imperialism is. And just one more point about it. Jacobin is a vehicle for Bernie Sanders. Jacobin attained influence as a vehicle for the Bernie Sanders campaign of 2016 and 2020. And two of its key editors wrote a book called like After Bernie, How We Can Continue the Bernie Legacy. Have they ever attacked Bernie like this? Because Bernie on the Ukraine war has been a complete supporter of US imperialism. He's been a rubber stamp for every aid package. He's been better on Taiwan. He's refused to support some missile sales, but the tenor of his 2020 campaign was anti-China, and I can just throw up his campaign page. It will sound a lot like Tucker. So where are they on their own guy? Why don't they, bring their boy home and give him a talk? It just doesn't feel right to me.
Yeah, I don't put any of these people on a pedestal. So Tucker has so many things I disagree with, but just like him, all these other outlets that are held up as being examples of pristine leftism have their own contradictions and blind spots as well. And again, Jacobin, you can. I mean, I like some of the stuff I read in Jacobin, but sometimes they buy into the dumbest propaganda. And same thing with Democracy Now. And I would never critique them as hard. I would never subject them to the kind of harsh language that we're calling Tucker a fraud and all that stuff. And it's like people have their areas where they can see clearly, and other places where they have their biases and they fall short. In the case of leftists, I think it's even more important to hold them accountable, because we know that Tucker Carlson, we don't expect him to be the beacon of leftism. He's a right-wing host. But when left-wing outlets parrot dangerous propaganda, as we saw with Russiagate and the Syria dirty war, which places like Democracy Now! Totally fell into, then they need to be held accountable as well. And it doesn't mean I think you dismiss them entirely. It just means you allow that criticism. But we don't criticize our leftist like outlets like Jacobin will not criticize people on the left like Bernie and Democracy Now! At all.
What about their softball interview with AOC? I mean, she's effectively pro-war. She co-sponsored an anti-China resolution with Ted Cruz denouncing China on Hong Kong. She voted for the 40 billion. They're responsible for her. So if you don't suck on the left, then you at least have a better ground to stand on to criticize Tucker. But if you're doing all of that, focus on your own house first and fix your own house, because we can't claim you as anti-war when you're responsible for AOC. You're still softballing her. You're still grandpa stroking Bernie when he's already endorsed Joe Biden. I mean, give me a break. And the ISO, which has merged with the DSA, at its socialism conference, it not only hosted China, so-called experts who are funded by the U.S. government through its regime change arm, the National Endowment for Democracy, who I believe have contributed to Jacobin. They also hosted students, supposed Nicaraguan students, who had been involved in the violent coup in Nicaragua. And again, I mean, you can just go back into Jacobin's archives. There's just piece after piece supporting the Syrian dirty war, attacking Venezuela's government. They have this guy, I think his name's Mike Gonzalez or something. They have all these Trotskyites supporting regime change. So when you want to purge all the Trotskyites and all the regime changers who are just basically proto-neocons from your midst, then the attacks might have more credibility. But it really just doesn't feel right to me. And at the Grayzone, I'm not gonna try to claim Tucker. I'm not saying or his position. We're not America first, but I'm also not claiming the position that the professional U.S. left takes anymore when they attack me every time I oppose a regime change operation.
Yep. And in the case of Syria, I mean, I've watching the trajectory first, kind of just as someone who's not really involved at all in the issue at all, but I saw all the hits you took. It's kind of gone from people vehemently attacking you for taking the positions you took to then once other people started affirming everything you were saying, once the truth became undeniable undeniable about the war in Syria and validating everything you were saying, that everyone's kind of just moved on and nobody wants to talk about it anymore.
Yeah, just like they moved on from COVID. All the people at Breakthrough News or whatever who like attacked me without naming me and would never debate me. They've completely moved on from that, and all the like scientifically bogus positions they took. Where's the? Why? I mean, I honestly, I like respect people like in some way. I respect Walker Bragman for trying to just argue for permanent lockdown still when everybody else has moved on. But there are other people still talking about the damage this has caused, and other people have accepted accountability for being wrong. Tucker Carlson said racist, horrible things about Iraqis, but he has taken some level of responsibility, if I'm not incorrect, by acknowledging that he was wrong on Iraq. And I think a lot of what he's doing to oppose these regime change wars is a form of taking responsibility. I was wrong on Syria in 2013. And people like Vanessa Beeley or Sharmeen Narwani, like or Eva Bartlett, who are right, they have a right to they had a right over the years to attack me for that. They had a right. But what I'm doing is trying to take accountability for that and take responsibility for that. I don't see that kind of accountability from the professional leftists who are celebrating Tucker's ouster. And what are they going to be duped by next? Which psyop are they going to fall for next? We can only imagine, and it's going to be horrible.